Hi, my name is Tony Hastrup. I'm one of the editors of JCMS. And JCMS is one of the journals of UACES, and we're pleased this evening to be doing two things, really. The first is presenting the Best Article Prize for 2017, and the second is sponsoring the annual lecture and the reception afterwards. And I'm really glad that you could all be here with us this evening, despite the very long day. It is my pleasure to welcome tonight's guest, Professor Terri Gibbons, to deliver the JCMS 2018 annual lecture this evening titled Immigration, Race, and Populism, Politics and Policies from Colonialism to Brexit. So to many of you working in comparative European studies, Terri needs no introduction. For about 2 decades now, Terri's research has focused on immigration policy, European politics, security, and she has an impressive publication list. And way before populism was the it thing to study, Terri was already doing that. Some of her books include Voting, Radical Right in Western Europe, Immigration Policy and Security, Immigrant Politics, Race and Representation in Western Europe. That might be familiar to some of you. Her latest book is called Legislating Equality, The Politics of Anti-Discrimination Policy in Europe. Terri, I understand, is working on another book, some of which themes she will be talking about this evening. Until June this year, Terri was provost of Menlo College, a liberal arts college in the United States. And prior to this, Terri was based at the University of Texas, Austin, where she was a tenured professor in European Studies, but also affiliated with the Center for Women and Gender Studies, Center for African and African American Studies. I thought it was really fascinating to know that Terri actually founded the Center for European Studies at the University of Austin, which still exists. Presently, Terri is the executive director of Edgemakers Institute, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to maximize student potential through research and development of the most effective methods of teaching innovation and creativity through collaboration with leading thinkers in education and technology. In this role, Terri harnesses her experiences in academic leadership, research, and teaching with a passion for advocacy for access to higher education and developing tools for student success so that one can ensure a wide range of students continue to find opportunities in higher education. I'm going to stop talking now because you didn't come here to listen to me, but please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Professor Terri Gibbons.
Thanks very much, Tony. And I want to thank JCMS and the UACES crew and the University of Bath for having me here. It's very exciting to be here. This is my first time attending the UACES conference. And the topics have been very interesting, despite the fact that you might have seen me nodding off a little bit in the Brexit discussion this afternoon. The jet lag is hitting me at times, but I have enjoyed the discussions thus far. Despite the fact that I'm no longer affiliated with the university, at least for the moment, I'm still very much interested in topics related to Europe, and I will continue to be writing on those topics. Actually, if you follow my website or blog or Twitter, I'm very, very active in following a lot of these topics as well as writing on these topics. I do regularly write blog posts. I just very recently wrote something on immigration. And one of my goals is to write on topics that are of interest transatlantically. So there's a lot going on right now that is very important both in Europe and in the US. There's a lot of things that are happening, including around populism, that are impacting both the US and Europe. And so a lot of my work going forward is really going to be focused on both the US and Europe, which it has in the past. Certainly a lot of the, particularly the immigration policy and security book was very much a transatlantic approach to these issues. So today I want to start off on a little bit on the personal front, because I've been in this field for a while, and been thinking a lot about issues of representation and so on. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know that our research is influenced by our own personal experiences. And as an African American first generation college goer, most people don't expect me to speak French or German or study immigration and radical right politics. And in fact, given that my name is gender neutral and non-ethnic sounding, many who meet me are surprised that I am the Terri Gibbons who wrote the book on the radical right. And so it's been very interesting to me to think about these issues from the perspective of an African American woman. Political science, unfortunately, is not well known for having a diversity of voices, although it's improving. I was just at APSA in Boston, and we saw a lot of programs are doing a better job of recruiting students from a variety of backgrounds. We have a lot of programming that is geared towards mentoring students of diverse backgrounds. And so I think we are getting the sense, well, we've had the sense for a long time, but we are recognizing that having voices from a variety of backgrounds is important. And it's interesting to me that, for example, in the US, we've had such a focus on the black-white divide. We're only in the last 10, 15 years, and actually I wrote an article on this in Annual Reviews, that we've only recently started to look at issues beyond the black-white divide. We're starting to see more surveys that bring in Hispanic and Latino voices, and there are new surveys and data being collected on Asian Americans, and actually recognizing diversity within the Asian American community, that we have South Asians and Chinese, Japanese, et cetera, and recognizing that there are major differences between those groups. And I think this kind of research is going to be important going forward as we look at how these divides are being turned into voting behavior and so on. So something I've noticed over the years as I've done my research and attended meetings in Europe and the US related to immigration, both from a policy and a research perspective, is I'm often the only person of color in the room. And it is rare to see research coming from the perspective of a person with an immigrant background, although I will note that I have worked with several researchers from Turkish origins. And Rasan Maxwell and I wrote our edited volume, Immigrant Politics, because we had become aware of the growing number of people of immigrant background in Europe who are becoming involved in electoral politics, many of them who were inspired by the election of Barack Obama in the US. And so coming from the perspective of a woman in political science, one of my first articles was on the gender gap in the vote for the radical right in Europe. And that's become a classic in the field. It was recently featured in an edited volume by Cass Muda that came out in 2016. And my life experience have clearly had an impact on my scholarship. I was initially drawn to learning French because of my mother's Louisiana heritage. My father was in the military, and my parents were actually stationed in Ruislip, England in the 1950s. And I had two sisters who were born there, so I have a UK connection. But although I was born stateside in 1964, I always heard about the family's experiences in Europe and saw pictures of my parents that traveled to Germany, Austria, and Italy. I dreamed of traveling to those places myself someday. And I'm also the product of migration. If you think about the great migration of African Americans within the United States, which had a huge impact on the distribution of demographics in the United States. For example, my grandfather was a sharecropper in Georgia on my father's side. He moved to Pennsylvania, where my father was born. While on my mother's side, my grandfather was a sharecropper in Louisiana, and he moved, although he stayed in Louisiana, my mother was part of the Great Migration in the 1950s who moved to Los Angeles. And it was in Los Angeles where my parents met, and when my father joined the military at the start of the Korean War. So I was ultimately the youngest of 7. My parents were devout Catholics, and I was born in Spokane, Washington. So migration is not just something that in the US that we talk about from crossing borders, but also internally. So it's something that I have to keep in mind as I think about immigration and migration, because the demographics in the US are very much aligned with the way that migration patterns were impacted by racial issues in the South and violence in the South, if you think about it. I could go on and on about that, but I'll leave that for another topic. And actually, my next book project, I do intend to talk to a certain extent about how migration is impacted by violence. And to a certain extent, the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North and the West in the US was impacted by issues of lynchings and the violence that they feared that kept them from being able to have fulfilling work and so on. Certainly for my parents, that played a great role in their lives and hoping for the futures of their children. In any case, my path led me to the study of international relations as an undergraduate student and study abroad in France when I was a student at Stanford University. And that's what led to my interest in immigration and immigrant politics in Europe. When I visited France for the first time in 1986, some of you may know that was a pivotal year for the far right in Europe. That's when Jean-Marie Le Pen's party, the National Front, had a breakthrough in a local election. And there were major protests. The Touche pas mon pot movement was starting around then and so on. So I just happened to be there at a propitious time. However, I didn't really start focusing on this topic until I actually worked for 6 years between undergraduate and graduate school. And I was applying to graduate school and happened to be reading an article about the Republicana in Newsweek magazine, and decided to, when I was writing my application for graduate school, to, hey, that's an interesting topic, the far right in Germany. Why don't I say I want to study that in graduate school? Funny thing is, that's what I actually ended up studying. But in any case, so I was very fortunate when I did go to UCLA for graduate school, that one of my advisors, Ron Rogowski, suggested that along with French, I study German. And he suggested that because he said there's lots of money to study German in Germany, and he was absolutely right. If there's any people who sponsor German organizations here, Germany, most of my funding for study in Europe has come from German sources. And I've spent a lot of time doing research and doing work in Germany. But in any case, that's just to give a little background on why and how I ended up where I am today in terms of my research interests. And I think it's interesting to keep in mind that not a lot of Americans or even political scientists study. Back when I was doing the work on immigration politics in the far right, there wasn't a big topic in the U.S. Amongst political scientists, and it's grown over the years. There was a group of us who tried to start a section within the American Political Science Association on immigration back in the late 90s, and had a hard time putting a group together. But now we have a very active migration and citizenship section in APSA. And I wanted to make a note. I went to a panel earlier today on asylum seekers, and it was all women. And I would note that our migration and citizenship section in APSA is has the second highest percentage of women in it. So I'm not sure why, but it seems to attract a large percentage of women, that particular topic. But in any case, so I decided for this lecture, and actually for my article, and looking at the publications I've done in the past, and what's happening in Europe and the US today, has really been, in a sense, an interesting lead up to things like the election of Donald Trump and Brexit and what we're seeing happening in Italy and so on. When I started studying the radical right around 1997, when I seriously started doing my dissertation research, I would talk to people about it and they say, oh, the radical right's just a flash in the pan. they're going to go away, and these parties aren't going to last. And so I was like, well, that's okay, my book, it's just my first book, it's fine. And now, of course, we know that most of these parties, even if they've had their ups and downs, like the Austrian Freedom Party, they've come roaring back to life. And in fact, we've seen the rise of new parties. When I was studying the radical right in Germany, we had the Republikaner and the NPD. Now we have the AfD, which is an entirely new animal, but a very strong one, stronger than any other far-right party in Germany. And the National Front, although they didn't have much success in terms of the presidential race and so on, has more seats than ever before. Although they've changed their name, I always forget what the new name is since it just got changed. I think it's a Popular Front or something like that. Rassemblement National, whatever that is. But in any case, what we see happening in Eastern Europe, of course, is also of concern. And so what I wanted to do is, a little bit of a review of some of the work I've done over the years and talk about how that has led up to where we are today. And I wanted to start off with the comparative politics of immigration. I'm actually working on a textbook on that, so I'll put out a little blurb for that. Also, I put that up so you know the books are still available to buy. And actually, you can get a really cheap copy of my most recent book if you go to the used and new editions on sale. But in any case, comparative immigration politics is that's something I've been teaching for many, many years. And I'm actually working on a textbook on it because there really isn't a good textbook out there that looks at the immigration politics from a comparative perspective, both the US, Europe, Australia, Canada. And it's, of course, a very important topic as we're seeing politically throughout the world, really. Unfortunately, it's hard to pull in a broader assortment of cases and still have a manageable textbook. I would love to include a broader set of countries, but for now we're focusing on some of the more mainstream countries of immigration. And with the current images of children in cages, in the US separated from their parents, in Europe would-be migrants floating on overloaded boats in the Mediterranean, politicians are struggling to find solutions to the ongoing issues related to migrant flows. And so immigration has become a flashpoint not only in the US, but we know it has had an impact on the Brexit vote in the UK, led to instability in Angela Merkel's government in Germany, and has influenced the rise of populist parties across Europe. And it's really difficult for me to think of a time since I began studying the politics of immigration in the 90s that the issue of immigration has had more of an impact on politics. So I'm going to give a brief overview of immigration policy developments in the US and Europe to look at how policy towards migrants has interacted with attitudes towards racial and religious minorities over time. Many studies have shown that recent voting behavior in the US and Europe has been tied to racism and xenophobia, and this will continue to be a challenge to democratic values as quote-unquote white populations become the minority amidst demographic change. And so as we look at immigration policy, starting with the US, one of the best texts on this is Dan Tishner's Dividing Lines, The Politics of Immigration Control in America. And this book explains how policy has gone from being expansive to restrictive at different points in history, and describes the players, particularly members of Congress and the judiciary, who've had an impact on policy. And although the Democratic Party and the left in general is seen as the proponents of policy that would potentially lead to legalization for immigrants, it was often Republican presidents who were champions of more expansive policies. Immigration policy in the US grew out of the development of a new country that was built around a mythology of being a country of immigrants, and it was pretty much a mythology. We've never really had much of a totally open policy. The reality is much more complicated because we know that European settlers came to a land that was already inhabited by indigenous peoples, Africans were part of the slave trade, a forced migration and system of chattel slavery that left their progeny enslaved until the end of the Civil War. And the immigration policies that eventually developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s were focused on keeping out undesirable groups. For example, immigrants from China were one of the first groups to be excluded from entering the country in the late 1800s and didn't begin to come into the country in large numbers until after the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act. And the funny thing is, many Americans don't know that. The early 1900s saw the rise of a racially based approach to immigration as restrictions shifted from Chinese migrants in California to migrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. The fact that many of these migrants were often poorly educated and from Catholic backgrounds did not play in their favor, particularly at a time when people from these regions were also seen as racially undesirable. And of course, as many of you know, this was a time of scientific racism or eugenics, and so there was these hierarchies that were created about who should be able to enter the country and who shouldn't. So this antipathy led to the passage of the Immigration Act of 1921 and the National Origins Quotas of 1924, which limited immigration to Northern and Western Europe for the most part. So it is important, however, to see this legislation in the broader context of an isolationist United States that came out of World War I very weary, and the issue of European refugees in the wake of the increase in flows from Southern and Eastern Europe raised concerns about a flow that would be difficult to assimilate. So assimilation was a big concern, the types of immigrants, and so the acts passed in the 1920s would limit immigration to the US until the mid-1970s, and it would have a devastating impact on Jewish refugees prior to the US's entry into World War II. So immigration policy changes in the 1960s have allowed migrants from more countries to enter the US. It has had a huge impact on our demographics. And immigration control remains a highly salient issue, as I will talk about later with the 2016 election. Undocumented immigration has become a particularly critical issue, as it has been easy for migrant laborers to find work, but difficult for them to get visas. And as the government has cracked down on undocumented immigrants, Spanish-speaking workers, particularly from Mexico, have borne the brunt of raids and deportations. And more recently, the most recent abhorrent approach has been to question the citizenship of Spanish-speaking and people of Mexican background on the border. In any case, to move on, the policy dynamics around immigration restrictions are similar in other countries, and so I will be talking a little bit about immigration policies in other countries, and I'm not going to get too much into colonial histories, I don't have time, but I do think that colonial histories played an important role in framing debates and challenges around issues of immigration and citizenship. The timing in which issues around citizenship were resolved or at least undertaken meant that immigration control policies may have consequences for migrants who may have previously had citizenship rights, as we can see in the case of the people of Mexican descent on the border in the US. But the debate that Britain was having as early as the late 1950s on how to resolve the influx of South Asian and Black migrants from the Caribbean was later replayed in the mid-1970s in Germany with the Turkish and Yugoslav migrants. And that debate came back to haunt the British as the Windrush generation, which arrived in the UK from the Caribbean from the 1940s to the 70s, grappled with issues of proving their citizenship. Another example that has continued to play a role in French policies and attitudes is Algerians who were considered citizens of France until independence in the 1960s. And so just touching on the issue of colonialism, that certainly played a major role in some of those citizenship debates. So Germany, to turn to Germany for a moment, German politicians were not willing to admit that they had become a country of immigration until the late 1990s. Of course, we know that Germany had the guest worker program after World War II when they needed to rebuild the country, but For a variety of reasons, both political and cultural, they were reluctant to change citizenship laws to make it easier for residents to naturalize, and an acknowledgement of immigration was difficult politically. Germany has struggled with acknowledging and integrating immigrants, particularly those from Turkey and others with Muslim backgrounds, and as I have studied the development of policies over the years, I've often been told by policymakers that it is a new issue for them, even though they've been dealing with it for at least 40 years. In any case, it's true that Germany hasn't had the devastating attacks committed by Islamic terrorists in the UK, France, and Belgium, but they have taken in the largest number of refugees in Europe going back to the conflicts in the Balkans. This has led to large settlements of Muslim immigrants in addition to previous Turkish settlements. And as the issue of immigration has become more salient across Europe, Germany has seen the rise of the anti-immigrant populist party, the AfD, or Alternative for Germany, that's taken advantage of the issue. And the Conservative Party in Bavaria created a crisis in Angela Merkel's government by insisting on harsher measures on the border, including placing refugees and asylum seekers into detention centers when they cross the border. And the most recent deal calls for returning asylum seekers to the first safe country where they landed, and stronger border checks, just thus saving Merkel's coalition, but putting it in jeopardy EU free movement protections. And actually, there's a variety of issues that have really impacted EU free movement. We're seeing more and more border protections being put in place in several, not just in Germany, but in several countries. So the Schengen free movement area is under attack on a variety of fronts. Although France is celebrating a World Cup football win with a team that is dominated by French citizens of immigrant background, many of them Muslims, for many years, France has had an ongoing debate about citizenship, Islam, and immigration policy. France has banned the wearing of the burqa in public places and has passed many restrictive immigration and integration policies over the years, including civic integration policies that were initially introduced in the Netherlands, include requiring language and civic education classes for those applying for citizenship, new arrivals, and those applying for visas from other countries. And not just France, Germany and other countries have focused more, and the EU, in their integration policies are focusing more on civic, civic integration. And actually I was having a discussion with Sam about this earlier, that integration policies are actually shifting more towards a form of immigration control. And so using things like language policies to place more restrictions on the giving out visas. So there's an overall trend toward more restrictions on immigration in recent years, but it is significant that the trend has specifically focused on racial and ethnic minorities. This is an issue that will continue to have salience in the political arena, particularly as populist politicians focus on the issue and gain influence in both the US and Europe. Whether this more restrictive trend will continue will depend on the electoral influence of both those wanting to restrict immigration and those more inclined to support more expansive policies, including recent immigrants. Okay, so next I'm going to shift to a look back at my book on the radical right, talk a little bit about the results of that and whether or not those results have much impact on where we are today. And so just going to try to give a quick summary of the results of voting radical right in Western Europe. And that study focused on the institution that determined the rules of the game. So this was really a discussion of voting behavior and institutions and how those affected what I call strategic voting. And I argued that changes in the rules of the game can have a dramatic impact on party development and electoral success. And this is highlighted by the impact of the change of electoral rules in France in 1986. In this election, the National Front was able to win seats because a proportional representation system was used. France usually uses a single-member dual ballot, more of a first-past-the-post type of system. And in that type of system, the FN usually didn't, our National Front didn't usually win seats. However, they did win when proportional representation was used. And when they returned, they did not win seats again. So We had kind of a natural experiment there of the impact of a particular kind of electoral system. However, the French case also highlights the role of cooperation between mainstream parties, which successfully kept the radical right from winning seats. The mainstream right in France, at least in the past, was willing to follow a moral consensus with the Republican front strategy, i.e. they would not collaborate or work with the far right. But this consensus broke down when the mainstream right found that the strategy was hurting the right's electoral chances. The mainstream right did, however, pursue a strategy of excluding the radical right to the point of sanctioning regional politicians who worked with the National Front. The mainstream right paid the price in the short term, i.e. they lost seats because they didn't collaborate with the National Front, but in the long term the strategy was successful in keeping the National Front from winning seats. In the cases I examined, the impact of institutions kept the German MPD and Republikaner from winning seats in the German Bundestag, i.e. the German dual ballot system, where one year you vote once for a party and once for a candidate, and the French National Front from winning more than one seat in the legislature, with the exception of the 1986 election. The electoral systems in Germany and France have provided the mainstream parties with a means to maintain their control of the legislature, and one would expect that they would avoid changes to these rules that might help change the balance of power. However, as we've seen, that hasn't held up in the most recent elections. The Austrian and Danish cases suggest that PR systems may make it difficult for larger parties to keep small parties from gaining vote shares. However, the Freedom Party could not have been successful, so the book talks more in detail about what happened with the Freedom Party. The Freedom Party was, just to give a brief summary, was came in second place in the Austrian legislative election of 1999, which has impact as well for my next book, Legislating Equality, where I talk about the response of the EU, which was the passage of the Racial Equality Directive. However, the Freedom Party could not have been successful without the change in economic conditions and immigration and the long-term presence of a grand coalition that appears to have sparked their success. And then the Danish People's Party actually went into supported a minority coalition in Denmark. Actually, and that lasted for about 10 years. And they also got a lot of the immigration policies that they wanted. In any case, the analysis showed that electoral institutions do matter, and and time is also an important consideration when studying differences in parties' success. Looking at parties' constituencies and other factors are important. So it is important, I think, to examine socioeconomic factors and so on. So to conclude, how does this analysis from 2005 hold up in 2018? First, if I were to redo this, I would take a look at the discourses, because I think discourse analysis is important. And I think that the discourses that were mainly the domain of the radical right in the 1990s have clearly shifted to the mainstream. Things that I was hearing coming only from the radical right in the late 1990s have now become clearly the rhetoric of conservative parties. As analysts like Cass Muda have noted, there has been a normalization of radical right rhetoric, not just for the rhetoric, but also the players in mainstream politics. What we called the cordon sanitaire, or basically keeping the mainstream parties keeping a distance between themselves and the far right, is no longer a guarantee, and has certainly not kept far right politicians from winning elections at all levels across Europe. The political climate has changed greatly in the last 15 years, and much of it is explained in my book, Legislating Equality, which I'll discuss next. So I have about 15 minutes to go. So for my most recent book, I don't know if it was happily, but I happened to be studying the Austrian Freedom Party in the late 90s. And it was a surprise to me that the EU passed the Racial Equality Directive, and that it was even supported by a country like France that hated to use the word race. And so I started to explore, well, what happened? Why did France in particular, and even Germany, support a racial equality directive? Well, first of all, it was a response to the success of the Austrian Freedom Party. The 15, or the other, besides Austria, the 14 EU countries felt when Jörg Haider's party made it into the Austrian government that they had to have some kind of response. And just as it happens, for about the last 7 or 8 years prior to this, there was a group called the Starting Line Group that had been proposing a EU directive that was about anti-discrimination policy. And so that directive just happened to be sitting there waiting for action, and was put forward by the Commission for action by the Council, and it was ultimately passed as a response to the success of Jörg Haider's party. And so what we saw prior to that, I dug back into the history, is the development beginning in the 1980s that began within the European Parliament. And in particular, I happily was able to meet a former member of the European Parliament, Glenn Ford, who was active in politics in the UK and happened to have been one of the key players in putting forward anti-discrimination policy, and as a response to far-right activities in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And so I was able to get a lot of source material going back into the 1980s from the European Parliament that for some strange reason wasn't available from the EU. But in any case, had access to a lot of the materials, the various commissions and committees that were put together to work on these issues related to immigration, race, minorities, and so on. And so what happened as these committees did their work is that you had civil society stepping in, and particularly this group that developed called the Starting Line Group that was made up of several nonprofit or NGOs. And they were working closely with members of the European Parliament to develop this legislation. And over time, as it evolved and so on, they were able to develop something that was actually acceptable by the time we got to 1999 and 2000 when it was passed. So as I worked on this project and did the backwards in time history and then moved forwards, it became clear that part of the reason that they were able to pass the Racial Equality Directive in 2000 was because you had, first of all, it was a response to the far right, but secondly, you had a majority of left-leaning governments at the time. And so as I moved forward in time and was studying the implementation of the Racial Equality Directive, it was passed at the EU level, and that had to be transposed into national law. The transposition wasn't quite as smooth. There were delays, and partly that had to do with the fact that you had conservative governments mostly in place when it came time for transposition of the Racial Equality Directive. And so you also saw resistance in Germany. A lot of legal scholars felt that this was not something that could be put into German law. In France, Actually, France embraced it fairly well, but over time there was issues around funding and so on. But Germany was probably one of the most resistant. And when I went to, so each country had to develop what was called an equality body. And for the Brits in the room, it was based on the Commission for Racial Equality in the UK. And actually, that was based on U.S. civil rights, the Equal Rights Commission in the U.S. And so there's this, you can see the links from the US to the UK, and then to what became the equality bodies in the EU. But unfortunately, in countries like the UK, where we started to see budget cuts to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which was the successor to the CRE, and so on, we saw that the focus on anti-discrimination policy was not maintained. And so over time, as the issue of anti-discrimination policy became less salient and the issues of immigration policy, minority rights, and so on were less salient for the politicians, then we no longer saw as much support. So in Germany, for example, the equality body only had about 20 employees on staff compared to 500 for the Equality and Human Rights Commission at its peak. That was slashed in half, and actually I have no idea where they're at now. But in any case, the 2008 fiscal crisis had a huge negative impact on most of the equality bodies. And as I had when my book came out in 2014, I had a meeting with some of the members of the ENAR, the European Network Against Racism, which has one of the bodies that was, or NGOs that was developed after the implementation of the Racial Equality Directive, and they were, I talked about the book and so on, and then they were asking me in somewhat plaintive terms, what could they do to try to improve the situation, and this was in 2015 when we still had an African American president, and I was tried to be supportive, but unfortunately we've seen with the election of Donald Trump in the U.S., we've seen a similar attack on civil rights and migrant rights in the U.S. And so I think I hate to end on a pessimistic note, but the 2016 election cycle really was an indication of, and actually, I talk about this in the book. We saw basically retrenchment in the mid-1900s, mid-2000s, and there's basically a backlash that impacted the focus on anti-discrimination policy to, as I mentioned previously, more of a shift from expansive approach to integration to a more restrictive approach to immigrant integration. Obviously a more restrictive approach to immigration control, although in Germany we did see a fairly open reception for refugees. I don't want to diminish that in any way, but now we're seeing a retrenchment on that front. And so in terms of, I'm a political scientist, and and from a political perspective, it seems that we're seeing a pendulum shift towards just a more restrictive environment more generally for immigration, and with that, anti-discrimination policy, particularly in Europe, tends to focus more on people of immigrant descent, and as well as ethnic minorities. And so, my concerns are that it's going to take a lot of political courage on the part of politicians who are hoping to encourage, for example, the political engagement of people of immigrant background, ethnic minorities, and so on. That's part of the reason we decided to do the edited volume on immigrant politics, is that one of the things I would see when I would come to Europe, and actually I was engaged in activities with, for example, the German Marshall Fund that sought to encourage people of immigrant background in Europe to become more involved and engaged in the political scene. And so I think that's, if I can give a short bit of, or a little bit of hope, I think that's where the hopeful signs are, is that what I'm seeing in the US is more political engagement amongst young people, particularly those of immigrant background, and there is growing political engagement amongst people of immigrant background in Europe across the board, and that's being encouraged by organizations like the German Marshall Fund. That's bringing together future leaders, both in the US and Europe. They have regular programs that work with these young people. And the result is that we're seeing more of them running for office. There are a variety of organizations, like my friend Sayub Bojwani, who has a group for new Americans that is encouraging people of immigrant background to run for office, and many of them have actually run for office and won. I think in the UK you see many people of immigrant descent running for office, and even in Germany, more and more you see people of immigrant descent running for office. And that's the hope for the future, is that even though we're seeing this backlash, that demographics don't lie. These groups, there is, in the U.S., in California in particular, people go back to what happened in California in the late 1990s, when California used to be fairly split between the Republicans and the Democrats. And then after the passage of Prop 187, which is a fairly restrictive immigration piece of legislation at the state level, immigrants mobilized, people of Hispanic descent in particular mobilized, and California's been pretty much a Democratic state ever since. And our state legislature is solidly in the hands of the Democrats. And so there's a lot of push to mobilize Latino populations across the country, and not just Latino populations, but a lot of different populations that are being impacted negatively by different policies that have come about. So if there is a hopeful note, I would say that's it. And even though immigration continues to be a major issue, I think one of my goals is, through my textbooks and my writings, is to focus on trying to keep it from being simplified. It's important that we remember immigration is a very complex issue. And we can't ignore the fact that there are people who are negatively impacted by economic factors and so on, but we also have to keep in mind that in places like the U.S., immigration has been a very important economic engine. I live in Silicon Valley. Immigration is very important for Silicon Valley's economic growth, but we also have to keep in mind that inequality is having a major impact on both people of immigrant background and people of all classes, really. And so inequality is another important factor that, as political scientists, we need to keep in mind as we look at these issues and how that is impacting people's attitudes on all fronts. And inequality just seems to be growing, certainly. But what I was having a discussion, and I'll end up here, with someone the other day. We think that inequality, we may have heard about some of the things people have been writing about this, and working class whites and so on. But there are very differing responses to inequality. I mean, if you look at the state of California, it's probably the most unequal state in the nation, and yet we haven't seen this shift towards populism. And even though we're not as poor perhaps as some of the states like Mississippi or and so on. So I don't know that it's necessarily inequality that's the issue, as it's just a basic lack of government and services and so on in a particular state. But in any case, I should probably wrap up there and leave us some time for questions. And I'm open to any kinds of questions you might have about my background, and if you want to talk more about colonialism or racial issues, anything. So, in any case, we have our. Please, again, if you have a question, wait for the microphone. And thank you.
Thank you, Terri. Very interesting. I happen to be a very good friend of Glyn Ford, and we worked together in the European
good.
Parliament at the time. Jeffrey Harris, my name is. Just a question, because you're here at a European Studies Conference. It's a good idea that you are here. We talk a lot about the impact of Trump on global affairs as well as on public opinion. He is a keen Brexiteer, of course, long before anybody even noticed the issue. And one of the questions which remains in the air is whether Trump is a quirk. The voting system, the WikiLeaks, we leave Russia out of this particular discussion, although it's obviously part of it. But is he just a quirk, or does his election represent a structural change in American politics which will lead to, firm establishment of the negative ideas which you're seeing? Because we have our own, we have elections in Europe all the time, European Parliament elections. That will be a test as to whether we've sort of turned a corner in the wrong direction. But so what would be your view of that? Because we discuss it in terms of trade and foreign policy, but is he just a quirk, or is he bigger than that?
Well, our midterm elections are going to be a test to see where we're at. But I do think his election was a quirk. However, I do think he's already had an impact on our institutions. So it would have been more of a quirk if the GOP had responded in a more responsible way to some of his actions. But since the GOP has basically given him free reign, I do think that we're seeing, unfortunately, I was having this discussion earlier today, that we're seeing a significant negative impact on things like norms and behaviors that we would have expected from leaders. I mean, just the fact that we've left, and to be fair, some of this was already happening before Trump. So you have to look at what was happening before Trump to things like norms, to regular order in Congress, in terms of dealing with judges, to presidential power more generally. And so Trump's general behavior, I think, is a quirk, just the bombastic and the fact that most of his people are criminals. I mean, we're basically being led by a mob boss. But I think that Trump is a quirk, but what's happening to our system is not. So. And there's another one here.
Hiya, Alexander Masarevich, University of Belgrade. I'm just wondering how do you bring in the concept of voter apathy into the rise of radical right-wing political parties and movements? I mean, Trump wasn't elected by 50% of the American electorate. Yes. It was by, 23% of the American electorate. And that's definitely something I think that needs to be considered here. Just wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Actually, there was a recent study that came out that basically it was because of non-voters that Trump got elected. Not voting is an American thing. We've always had extremely low turnout, and first of all, the fact that people aren't automatically registered, although some states have shifted to automatic registration, so that's changing. So we'll see if that spreads. But our voter registration is low, our voting is low, and even we'll see. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with this midterm election. So there's a lot of work being done to try to get more people registered, especially young people, with the issues around gun violence and the shootings in schools and so on. I think that in general, this issue of voting is always going to be a problem in the U.S. And it's not just because people don't register and don't vote, it's also voter suppression. We have major issues with certain states and localities that make it very difficult for people to vote. There was an attempt in Georgia where there's a black candidate for governor to shut down polling places in a district. And so, we have to have constant, different organizations, or the ACLU in particular, have to be constantly vigilant to make sure that they aren't, but they're getting away with it in some places. This guy who's running for governor in Ohio, Chris Kobach, is a master of voter suppression. And in any case, the Republican Party in particular has really been working hard at various dirty tricks and things to keep people from voting. So.
Hi, thank you. Adrian Favell from Leeds. Yes, thank you, Terry. I think it's really important, your message really, to bring the US-Europe comparison into our thinking about migration in Europe. And as you point out, I think thinking about race, migration, colonialism, and international relations maybe as well.
Yes.
It's extremely complicated as well once you start thinking about this. But it's important for us to remember, I think, that the US has a negative kind of image a lot of the time for Europeans, but on migration and race, there's at least two things that we've learned. One is, the influence of racial equality thinking has been important, as you pointed out, and also I think this image of super diversity, as in California, as a potential for progressive politics. Mm-hmm. I think these continue to be influences, I think, in the European context, where we have a long way to go on these things. But I wondered if you could comment a bit on what you see as the difficulties of doing comparative research, so that we get the idea of the necessity to think about Europe in terms of the US, but what are the difficulties in thinking comparatively between North America and Europe, if you like?
Well, probably the biggest issue in terms of thinking comparatively is just, if you're a graduate student thinking about this, is just the complexity, right? And trying to figure out how do you compare such different, because as political scientists, we tend to look at political institutions and systems. And so it's much easier to work within a particular system than it is to compare across systems. Now, one way to approach it would be to look at it in terms of federalism, and some people have tried to do that. The U.S. as a federal system, Europe or Germany as a federal system, and so on. But where I've run into difficulties is, there's just, again, I don't want to just simplify it by saying complexity, but there's various complexities. So in the U.S., we've had long-standing we've had a long-standing approach to immigration that, even though it changes over time, it's been a particular approach of we basically let 1 million people in every year, or 2 million actually, once you count the family reunifications and so on. And it's not the same in Europe. It depends on how you look at it. It is about, across the EU, I think it's close to similar, about 2 million every year. But it varies from, you got all these different countries, you got all these different rules. And even though there has been attempts to focus on it at the EU level, you still have, a whole bunch of different member states and non-member states, and dealing with a whole bunch of basically, like I said, with my comparative immigration textbook, I'm only looking at a few countries. I'm looking at France, Germany, a little bit of Spain and Italy, the UK, of course, Australia and Canada. Because once you get beyond that, and even there, I'm being very limited in terms of, I'm focusing mainly on the US France and Germany in terms of the broader, main cases, and partly because the U.S. is a kind of an older country of immigration, Germany is a newer country of immigration, and France is somewhere in between. So kind of looking at time period, how long they've been countries of immigration. And then, of course, you can look at things like colonial histories and various other factors. But you have to accept that these are going to be very qualitative approaches for the most part. You can obviously look at data from more recent, in terms of numbers of immigrants and so on, but it's going to be very difficult to do strictly quantitative approaches to these cases, depending on the kind of question. So a lot of it depends on the kind of questions you're looking at and how you want to approach it. But if it's just a purely descriptive approach, you have to find certain key factors that you want to compare. And what I've found is that you can do it. We do it on a regular basis. I've been involved in many edited volumes that look at immigration from various perspectives. So, for example, I recently was involved in an edited volume that looked at, more broadly at I did a chapter on immigrant integration for an Oxford handbook. And so from that perspective, looking at how more recently immigrants are being integrated into various countries. And that's a topic where several people these days are working on various typologies and approaches that are being taken. Like I mentioned, civic integration is kind of the more recent approach. So there are ways to do it, but you just have to accept complexity.
Stand up. Gabrielle Abels, University of Tübingen in Germany, and thanks very much, Terri, for your talk. And I have a question. I would like to have your ideas, given that you've done your research on voting for the radical right in Europe for such a long time. And you emphasize the factor of social inequality, but I always say to my students, if it's social inequality that's the key issue, then I would expect particularly single women to vote for the radical right. Yeah. But demographics tells a very different story. Right. So what is your idea then about how gender fits into that picture? Right. And identity issues, which are, we probably both agree that these are very, very important, and that's why we have the demographics for the radical right. But maybe you do see more long-term changes here from previous days until today. Yeah,
actually my point was more that inequality doesn't explain the vote for the radical right. So when I was doing my research back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, you could see that there was a very large gender gap in the vote for the radical right. But if you look at the vote for conservative parties, that's very different. So in the U.S., especially white women tend to vote for Republicans, consistently over 50%. And of course, we know that Trump had 53% of white women voted for Trump. And that's just consistent with women who vote Republican. So in terms of the vote for the radical right, there are clearly other factors at play, and some of it has to do with social class, some of it has to do with their perceptions of particular issues. So for example, in the late 90s, early 2000s, the radical right was very reactionary, talking about women need to be at home and things like that. So they just were not very appealing to women. But a lot of that has changed. They aren't coming out as, some are, but many of them are trying to be more modern. You know, you've got Marine Le Pen, who's really focusing more on Muslims, and you've even got a situation where they're using Muslims as a foil to say, oh, these Muslims are anti-woman, and so on. And so I think that is creating a shift where maybe more women are interested in the message of the far right. And certainly in the US, we've seen a consistent support for far right movements by women. We don't have a vote because we don't have a far right party per se, but certainly there is support amongst women for far right positions and so on. So in any case, I think it's more complicated than we may think, and that we're going to have to watch how this develops over time, and that the parties have evolved since I was really focusing on it more in the late 90s. So I think that we're going to see, especially since the mainstream parties have taken on a lot of the rhetoric, that you're going to see the balance between the male versus female vote for these parties is going to become less distinct.
Final question. Yes. So.
Philomena Murray, University of Melbourne. I come from a country which is one of the most racist in the world towards not just immigrants but towards refugees. There are 2,000 people incarcerated in gulags which resemble concentration camps. 140 of those are children and half of those were born into captivity. We have a system where it has moved on considerably to a narrative of exclusion and basically of regarding anyone who comes by boat or those who are regarded as illegal people to basically that they end up in these islands, Nauru and Manus Island, or the 28,000 people who are on temporary protection visas are being undermined and all of their financial support is being taken away. What we need to do is to change the narrative, when we need to change the government. But we need to change the narratives as well. So we've set up a group called Academics for Refugees. We've got a website. We've put forward a policy paper and we're doing a National Day of Action on the 17th of October in Australia. But we welcome support from all over the world. So when you say, let's see how it evolves, how it's evolving is we have people being regarded who are seeking asylum as being illegal people. There is no positive discourse of the positive transformation of society that is wrought by immigrants and by refugees, and there's an undermining of all our international obligations in Australia. So I think when we talk about what happened, and you know, I like you, I've worked on Le Pen, the first Le Pen, and others, really what we've now seen is the legitimizing of the totally unacceptable. So we've just won a Jean Monnet network to compare the externalization of refugee policy in Europe and Australia. Please come and see me if you want to become involved in some way or come to our events. But I really think that that's the sort of comparative work we need to be doing more and more, because we know in Hungary and Poland, Australia is being regarded as a model, and we need to do everything we can to push back against that. So I suppose I'm basically following on from what you're saying rather than presenting you with a question, but you said, let's see how it moves on from here. And unfortunately, I think that is how it moves on from here. So thank you for your presentation, and I'm sorry for ending on a negative note, but we are looking at thousands of people suffering in Australia, quite apart from what's happening here in Europe. Thank you.
Yes, agreed. Just one last follow-on from that, because we've got similar situation, of course, as we know in Greece. And of course, in the US, we're heading in that direction as well, with the the growing number of detention centers and children separated from their families. So I do not give the US a pass on this in any case. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terri. If you'll join me in thanking Terri for a very, very fascinating talk. And I should also remind you there's a reception across the yard where we had lunch earlier. Thank you all for staying to the end.